Hello ladies and gentlemen, we are Group 2 of the PAD 350 for Fundamentals of Sustainable Development Group, in which we will be presenting on the topic of explain challenges encountered by the National Sustainable Development Goal Roadmap that Malaysia has developed towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Muhammad Al-Khwarizmi bin Muhammad Ramiz, student number 2024986-407.
Hi, my name is Rahman Biakarudin. My student ID number is 2024945347.
Assalamualaikum and hi, my name is Muhammad Farid bin Muhammad Iskandar and my matrix number is 2024573-603.
So, before we get deeper into our topic, I'd like to now basically give you a brief introduction of our topic. So, the Sustainable Development Goals were 17 goals implemented by the UN in 2015 intended to be completed by 2030. It succeeded the MDGs, the Millennial Development Goals, before that. So, the aim of the goal is to end poverty, to create equality, protect the environment, etc. So Malaysia has integrated these SDGs through various development initiatives and with the 12th Malaysian Plan, as well as with the National SDG Roadmap, all intended to get various stakeholders involved. So, what are some achievements that Malaysia has accomplished so far? So we have the green economy, we have the 4 billion ringgit in climate finance initiatives, all intended to be turn Malaysia into a more greener economy by the year 2050. So, though these are the positives of it, the implementation of the SDG, particularly in Malaysia and the Southeast Asian region, still faces various challenges, including weak implementation, limited local funding, data gaps, and low transparency. All of these issues come together. It creates a more slower implementation of our roadmap towards a more sustainable future.
And now we will talk about the financial and resources constraints.
One of the main challenges Malaysia faces in achieving its sustainable development goals is the lack of funding. Many SDGs projects require a large amount of money to be successful, but the available funding is still not enough to meet the country's need. As a result, some important projects are delayed, reduced in size, or cannot be even fully implemented. This problem is especially noticeable in areas such as clean water, infrastructure development, and climate action. For example, improving water system, building sustainable transportation networks, and investing in renewable energy. Of course, all of these require significant financial resources. Without sufficient funding, progress in this such area becomes slower and might be not even enough. Although the government has introduced alternative financing methods such as green sukuk and SDG bonds, these initiatives are still relatively small compared to the overall funding needed. It's still not enough. Local government also face financial limitation, even though they are responsible for carrying out many projects at the community level. Therefore, increasing investment and improving financial support will be important if Malaysia wants to achieve its SDG goals by 2030.
So, the second financial and resource constraint is that we have an over-reliance on the public sector, meaning the private sector isn't as involved, but it's not to say they're not, it's just that they're less compared to public. So, Malaysia are an upper middle income country. So when this happens, what happens is we do not get international aid to help us, for example from ODAs, where the richer, more developed countries provide financial assistance to the lower developed countries. We are developing, so we're not considered within that bracket. Secondly, our domestic tax revenue only sits about 11 to 12% of our GDP, which is one of the lowest in our region, Southeast Asia, compared to the next, which are Vietnam and Thailand, which sit about at 15 to 20%. Secondly, we have an estimated SDG financing gap at around 50 to 7 billion annually ringgit, which is not fully only for SDGs, but it's through development initiatives in which we do implement these SDGs. Secondly, because of our COVID-19 post-pandemic policies, we've been slower to implement these more greener initiatives because we've allocated funds elsewhere, for example, in healthcare and education, etc. And then because of this, our public debt has risen over 60%. And then, for example, local governments, they rely mainly on property tax, licensing fees, and federal grants, which is where we get our income. So most of this money is then implemented back into the economy through investment. And then a lot of these municipalities, they lack the funds needed because the funds or the debt has risen. It gives them less to use.
Another challenge is the limited involvement of the private sector in SDG financing. Businesses and companies have the potential to contribute a lot through investment, innovation, and sustainable business practices. However, many companies are still not actively involved, and their participation often voluntary rather than mandatory. Because reporting is mostly voluntary, it can be difficult to measure how much companies are actually contributing towards sustainable development. Some companies may support, but some are not. It is hard to evaluate those impact and efforts. Another issue is the funding process for community projects. Many civil society organizations depends on grants and support funds to run programs that help local communities. However, funding approval can be slow and payment delays sometimes affect project. Of course, it's effective. Without accurate information, policymakers cannot make the best decisions. These challenges reduce the effectiveness of SDG planning and slow Malaysia overall progress.
So our next adventure that we will be delving into is the data and monitoring gaps issues.
One challenge Malaysia faced in the lack of detailed data for marginalised group. In 2018, over 14% of SDG indicators had no baseline data. Although 88% of indicators are now available, less than one-third are fully broken down by income, gender, age, ethnicity, disability, and location. A 2025 UNFPA study also found missing data for 9 out of 20 disability-related SDG indicators, making it difficult to create effective policy for vulnerable groups. Another challenge is inconsistent data collection across agencies. Different methods and reporting schedules make data difficult to compare. The National SGD Indicators database is active in only 6 of 16 states, and some important indicators have not been updated since 2019. As a result, SDG reports may rely on estimate and provide less accurate information. Also, Malaysia also faces weak monitoring and coordination of SDG implementation. More than 20 ministries and 60 agencies are involved, but there is no dedicated SDG secretariat. A small unit with fewer than 20 officers manage coordination. According to the 2026 Auditor General reports, only 34.1% of projects under the 12th Malaysia Plan were completed on time, while SDG Progress Report from 2023 to 2025 have not yet been published.
And next, we will talk about the institutional capacity issues regarding the SDGs.
Okay, so what are the three main issues when it comes to institutional capacity issues? So this is lack of enforcement officers or officers in general in these municipalities or SDG councils. So there are three. Limited technical expertise at local government level. Secondly, low awareness and understanding of SDGs between urban and rural. And then insufficient community engagement mechanisms. Okay, so what do I mean when I say limited technical expertise? So firstly, it just means that local governments have lack of manpower to successfully implement SDGs. Okay, so a lot of it nowadays, or currently 2026, there are a lot of issues when it comes to SDG councils because they lack and have so many vacancies. And then with so many vacancies, it's really hard to implement successful SDGs. Secondly, the low awareness and understanding of SDGs, we have to understand that only about 28% of our country knows about SDGs. In rural areas, it's about 16%, and in indigenous areas, it sits at about 8% or lower. And then the rest are, foreigners, etc. So additionally, there's lack of training or awareness or promotion on these SDGs unless they are educational facilities like us. So that's where we normally emphasize SDGs. But if you go to a local government office, you rarely see anything to do with SDGs. And then thirdly, insufficient community engagement mechanisms. Because it's so understaffed, there's not enough programs to be done, etc. So this is what causes the institutional capacity issues, which eventually SDGs don't become an important topic in most talks.
And now we're going to talk about socio-economic and environmental trade-off.
Malaysia is increasing its effort to expand renewable energy and achieve net zero emission by 2050. Through the National Energy Transition Roadmap, the government aims to attract more than 600 million in green investment while integrating sustainability into future development plans. These efforts are important because Malaysia continues to face environmental challenges such as deforestation, climate change, haze pollution and dependence on fossil fuels. With renewable energy currently making up only about 20% of energy capacity. Besides, Malaysia has successfully reduced overall poverty levels, but inequality remains a challenge. The government continues to improve infrastructure, healthcare, and education in less developed states such as Sabah, Sarawak, Kelantan, and Perlis to promote more balanced development. Policies also focus on inclusive growth and reducing income inequality. In addition, the gender pay gap is gradually narrowing, while new initiatives are being introduced to increase women's workforce participation, which currently stand at 55 to 56% but below the SDG target of 70%. Last but not least, Malaysia is strengthening climate adaptation and resilience measures to address growing environmental pressures. There is increasing awareness and action on issues such as rising sea levels, flash floods, drought, and transboundary haze. However, challenges remain with 82% of Malaysian city leaders reporting insufficient funding for climate resilient projects. Stronger cooperation between federal and state government is also needed to improve management of land, water, and forest resources and support SDG implementation.
And we will talk about public awareness and public participation regarding the SDGs. Final challenge is public awareness and participation. Achieving as the SDG is not only for the higher hierarchy such as government, civil servant, private sector, the one who get a lot of power or money. However, ordinary citizen is almost important as the high hierarchy. When people do not understand the SDGs, they are less likely to participate in activities that support sustainable development. For example, they may not be aware for the importance of environmental protection, responsible consumption, or even community development programs. Awareness is especially low in rural and indigenous communities. There's not much going of information in there. Of course, the educational opportunities, of course, is limited. In addition, the cooperation between civil society organization, the private sector, and the government is still relatively weak. These groups often have limited influence in decision-making processes, which reduce the impact they can make. Funding limitation and accountability issues also create obstacles. Therefore, increasing public education and encouraging community participation among different stakeholders will be most important for helping Malaysia achieve the SDGs by the 2030.
And now we're moving on to the next point, which is the external and global challenge.
Right, we now come, as mentioned before, into our third point, which is the external and global challenges. Okay, so there are three main external and global challenges, you could say. First is the impact of global economic volatility. Secondly, climate change effects on development gains or progress. And then post-pandemic recovery pressures. So what we have to understand from impact of global economic volatility is that because there's lack of funding, it's really hard for us as a country to successfully implement initiatives to work towards these SDGs. So, for example, as mentioned, our tax rate is 11 to 12%. So if we're only getting 11 to 12% to successfully, take on initiatives and SDGs, it's really difficult because there's too little to do so much by in the next 4 years. Okay. Secondly is the climate change effects on development gains. So one of the major issues right now is air pollution, rising sea levels, etc. When this happens, it threatens agricultural and coastal communities. Most of these coastal or agricultural communities, they focus on sustainable development when it comes to life on sea, etc. So when this happens, it becomes an issue for us to successfully implement these SDG initiatives. Secondly, with the transboundary haze and river pollution, which affects health economy. For example, our transboundary haze from Indonesia that comes to Malaysia, it pollutes our air. Obviously, this has effects on the economy, but also it affects the SDG goal implementations. Thirdly is the post-pandemic recovery pressures. What we have to understand is that COVID-19 resulted in increased spending in health and infrastructure to do with health. When this happens, a lot of the allocated budget that comes to development towards SDGs, for example, more clean energy, etc., they've all been redistributed and directed towards health. And this has caused an issue for us to progress further as a nation towards achieving these SDG goals. To conclude our presentation, we must understand Malaysia's national SDG roadmap is designed well on paper, but this report that we've presented shows that serious challenges are actually holding back progress towards 2030 goals. And in particular, we don't really have much time left. We have about 4 years. First, governance is a major issue. The SDG Council in Malaysia is inactive, so there's no dedicated secretariat to drive the work and to project complete rates. Currently sit at about just 34%. So then there's funding. Malaysia faces an annual short of RM 50 to 70 billion. Local governments also have very limited revenue, and it's hard to fund SDG related projects without funding. Data systems are another weak point. Less than 1/3 of SDG indicators are fully broken down by key factors like age, gender, and location. And vulnerable groups that aren't a part of these urban or rural areas don't get their minds or their perspectives taken into account for. Implementation is also fragmented. Too many ministries and agencies are working in silos. That leads to poor coordination. They can't work together, and federal-state cooperation has remained weak. Accountability is also limited. Parliamentary oversight into the progress of these SDGs lacks. Progress reports go unpublished. And then there are no real consequences when targets are missed. If you miss it, you miss it. So all these issues together have created a large and troubling gap between SDG planning and actual implementation, which has set back our progress towards a more sustainable development country by 2030. Thank you for listening.